If someone had told me that a stubborn engine, an unexpected heat wave, and a woman named Eloise would flip my entire perspective on love and timing, I would have called them nuts. But life rarely gives warnings before it changes you. This wasn't a story about fixing a car. It was about fixing something deeper, something inside her, and maybe inside me too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The day I first pulled up to that brick house on Willow Creek Lane, I thought it would be like any other service call. I was 28, working freelance as a mobile mechanic after quitting my dealership job. The flexibility was great, the pay was decent, and honestly, I liked the solitude. I'd drive around the valley fixing up whatever the local folks needed. Busted, starters, worn brake pads, clunky suspensions. People usually kept to themselves. I'd do the work, get paid, and be on my way. Clean, simple, no strings. But that house had stood out. Not because of how it looked, but because of how it felt. Pale blue siding slightly faded from the sun, overgrown rose bushes snaking along the white porch railing, and a yellow vintage mailbox shaped like a birdhouse. The kind of house that seemed to be trying hard to stay cheerful, even though time had worn it down a bit. I parked my van and hopped out, scanning the driveway for the car in question. There it was, an old red Volvo who'd popped, a trail of dark oil staining the concrete below. I was halfway unloading my tools when the door opened. Out stepped a woman in cut-off denim shorts, a loose linen blouse, and oversized sunglasses. That probably did more to hide her expression than the blazing sun ever could. She waved, then started walking over, barefoot, confident, casual, but there was a guardedness to the way she moved. Like someone used to doing everything alone but still hoping not to. "You must be Jay," she said, voice low and smooth with the slight rasp of someone who laughs a lot or once did. I nodded and told her I'd take a look first, before diagnosing anything. She smiled politely and stepped back, folding her arms. That was the first time I noticed how poised she was. Not stiff, but measured. Like someone who'd built invisible walls around herself over time. The engine was a mess. Gasket leak, maybe. More, it would take time. A few hours at least, if I was lucky. I rolled up my sleeves, popped in my earbuds, and started working. She stayed nearby, sometimes sitting on the porch steps, sometimes talking on the phone quietly. Every now and then, I'd catch her glancing over like she wanted to say something but didn't. 2 hours in, I finally took a break, wiping my hands on a rag and leaning back on my heels. That's when she offered me lemonade. I wasn't expecting that. Clients rarely offered anything, let alone something cold and homemade. I followed her to the porch where a sweating pitcher and 2 mismatched glasses waited on a wicker table. She poured silently, then handed me one. "It's too hot." "To pretend we're strangers," she said, finally breaking the silence. "I'm Eloise." I gave her my name again, and we clinked glasses, the ice chiming gently. The lemonade was sharp, almost sour, but in a refreshing way. Kinda like her. Over the next hour, our conversation stayed light neighborhood gossip. The weird local diner that served spaghetti sandwiches, and a stray cat that had claimed her porch as its kingdom. But beneath the surface, something was forming. Not flirtation, not yet. Just curiosity. A sense that both of us were waiting for the other to say something real. I finished for the day with the promise to return tomorrow. The car needed a new part I didn't have in the van. As I packed up, she stood at the edge of the porch with the cat twining around her ankles. She didn't say goodbye, just nodded like we had an unspoken agreement that this wasn't the end. Driving away, I felt odd. Not like I was leaving a job site, but like I'd just closed the first chapter of something. Maybe that was just the heat messing with me. Or maybe it was the way her smile had lingered just a second too long. That night I found myself thinking about her more than I should have. She had presence like she took up space without trying. There was a quiet strength. In her, something built from experience and probably a little pain. I didn't know her story, but I knew it had weight. When I returned the next morning, she was already outside waiting. Same porch, same cat, same guarded smile. But this time, she brought out 2 cups of coffee instead of lemonade. Black, no. Sugar. It tasted awful, but I drank every drop. As I worked, she talked more. About her job as a freelance editor, her love for old movies, her refusal to join social media. And I shared things too, which I normally never did with clients, about my dad's old repair shop. How I fell out with my brother. How I sometimes felt like I was running in place. That's when I realized something strange was happening. Wasn't just fixing her car. I was letting someone in. She was doing the same. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She didn't flirt. She didn't try to impress. But when she looked at me, it felt like she saw more than just a guy with grease-stained hands. She saw something beneath it. And somehow that made me feel like more than just a mechanic. I didn't know it then, but this wasn't just a 2-day job. It was the start of something that would slowly, stubbornly, and gently change both of us one moment at a time. The second morning unfolded in slow motion. It's the way certain days do when you're not rushing toward the next obligation. There was no urgency to get the repair done quickly, no pressure from her to finish fast, and for once, I wasn't watching the clock either. Eloise had brought her laptop out to the porch and sat cross-legged on the swing, editing something for a client. She wore these wireframe glasses that caught the sunlight and gave her this quiet librarian energy. Except she also had tattoos running up her forearm and one peeking from her collarbone. Nothing about her made sense in a single sentence, and maybe that's what made her interesting. I worked under the hood, elbow deep in engine grease, while snippets of conversation floated across the driveway. She'd talk to her cat, to herself, to her computer screen. I didn't always respond, but I listened. That day, she told me she used to love long drives with the windows down and music too loud, but now, the thought of her car breaking down made her stay close to home. I asked her what changed, and she just said, time, in a way that felt heavier than the word could carry on its own. Around noon, she offered grilled cheese sandwiches, and I didn't say no. We ate on the porch, both of us slightly sweaty from the rising heat, laughing over how she always burned one side of the bread no matter how careful she tried to be. She told me about the time she got caught in a thunderstorm on the side of a mountain during a solo hiking trip, and how she learned not to fear silence after that. I told her about the first car I ever fixed on my own and how proud my dad had. Then, even though it stalled again a day later, these were the kind of stories you didn't usually tell strangers, but somehow she didn't feel like one. It was on that porch, sipping iced tea from a mason jar, that I realized we'd reached some kind of unspoken rhythm. There were still walls between us, but small pieces were crumbling down. Nothing obvious, just a shift in the air, longer glance, a softer tone. The silence between our words started to feel less like gaps and more like invitations. I stayed. Longer than I needed to that day. The job was basically done, the car back to running shape, but I found myself triple-checking things. Tightening bolts that didn't need tightening, pretending like there was just a bit more to do. When I finally started packing up, she walked with me to the van. The cat trailed behind us like a silent chaperone. I was wiping my hands when she said, almost too casually, "So, do I call you next time it dies on me? Or is this strictly a one-time hero situation?" There was a playful edge to her voice, but something else under it too. A flicker of vulnerability. I smiled and told her she could call me any time, correlated or not. She nodded like she expected that answer, but appreciated hearing it anyway. The next day, I didn't have a job lined up, but I drove back to her street anyway. No tools this time, just me and a box of cinnamon rolls from the cafe down the hill. I told myself I was just checking to make sure everything was running smoothly. Truth was, I wanted to see her again. She didn't seem surprised when she opened the door and saw me standing there. If anything, she looked relieved. We sat in her kitchen that day, the kind of kitchen with half-peeled wallpaper and mismatched mugs and a magnet collection on the fridge from places she said she'd never been to, but hoped to, one day. The sunlight poured in through a cracked window pane, and it felt more like a memory than a moment. We talked for hours. It's about her divorce 3 years ago, how she gave up on dating apps after one too many awkward coffee shop meets, and how she started therapy just to remind herself she was allowed to take up space again. I listened. Not just politely, fully, because every word she said mattered more than it should have. She didn't sugarcoat things, didn't dramatize them either. She just laid it out. Out honest, bare, human. And something inside me softened in response. Later that afternoon, we sat on the porch again, this time saying very little. Her feet were tucked beneath her on the swing, and I leaned back on the top step, arms behind me. That's when she looked over and said it quietly, like it wasn't meant to land as heavily as it did. You're so young and handsome, and I'm already 42. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew whatever I said next had weight. She wasn't fishing for compliments. It wasn't flirtation. It was fear wrapped in a passing observation. A fear that maybe the way she saw me wasn't the way I could see her. That age, that invisible marker had drawn a line in the sand. She was afraid I couldn't cross, but I'd already crossed it, hadn't I? Without even knowing when or how. Somewhere between the burnt sandwich and her story about hiking in silence, I had crossed into her world, and it didn't feel strange. It felt right. I finally turned to her and told her the truth that her age wasn't something I noticed in a way that mattered. That the way she carried herself, the way she saw the world, the way she made space for people, all of that made her more radiant than anyone I knew in my own generation. She didn't respond with words. It's just a small smile and the kind of silence that says, "Thank you." Without saying anything at all, I left a little later that day, but it didn't feel like leaving. It felt like the beginning of something I couldn't name yet. For once, I was okay not knowing where it would lead. The days that followed were filled with small, gentle invitations. She'd text me photos of her garden, ask if I'd tried a new coffee place nearby, or send me songs she thought I might like. I found excuses to stop bio-adjusting her headlights, checking her brakes again, fixing the radio that only played static after 6 p.m. None of these things needed fixing, really. But maybe we both did. The strange thing about connection is that you rarely notice it forming in the moment. It doesn't come crashing in like a storm. It slips in slowly, like sunlight through a curtain, warming things before you realize you've been cold. That's what it felt like with Eloise. Day by day, moment by moment, we started orbiting each other more closely. We still never acknowledged anything directly, and maybe that was the safety of it. Nothing spoken, nothing broken. But in the way she would brew 2 cups of coffee before I arrived, in the way I'd park in the same spot every time like I already belonged there. It became clear that this wasn't about a car anymore. It never had been. She invited me over. One Saturday morning, it was the first time it wasn't under the pretense of fixing something. There was no check engine light to justify my presence, no oil leak or stalling ignition. It's just a text that said, "I made too many pancakes. Come help." It made me laugh. I showed up 20 minutes later with a container of blueberries and a 6-pack of those little glass yogurt jars she loved. When she opened the door, she was wearing a vintage concert tee and sweatpants, her hair pulled into a low, messy bun. She looked like a painting flawed in all the most compelling ways. Every detail grounded in real life, not polished fantasy. She let me in without a word, as if I'd always been welcome. We ate breakfast on the floor of her living room, because the table was buried under a stack of manuscripts and unopened mail. Her cat was curled into a loaf by the window, unbothered. As usual, she put on some old jazz vinyl that crackled at the edges, the kind that made even silence feel alive. We talked less that day, but the quiet wasn't awkward. It was thick with comfort. I learned she used to sing in college, that she once wrote a novel and never showed it to anyone, that she had a sister she hadn't spoken to in years. I told her more about my mom, about how I still called her every Sunday even though we had little to say. We traded little truths like gifts, never asking for anything in return. Later that afternoon, while she was folding laundry, I offered to replace the old light fixture in her hallway. It was one of those old globe-style ones that buzzed and flickered like it was haunted. I had seen it before, every time I walked past it, but hadn't said anything until then. She raised an eyebrow but handed me a stepladder and said, "If you die, I'm not explaining it to your mother." I told her she'd have to explain it to my dog, which made her laugh hard enough to snort. That sound stayed with me for hours after I left. I found myself replaying it in my head, not because it was funny, but because it was rare. People don't laugh like that when they're still guarding parts of themselves. The days continued like a gentle tide. Some I saw her, some I didn't. But even when I didn't, she was there in the songs I played on the drive home. In the way I caught myself checking my phone a little too often, my work started to feel different too. Other clients blurred together, just stops on a list. But Eloise was the name that made my heart beat faster when I saw it light up my screen. One evening, after finishing a job across town, I found myself parked outside her house with no real reason. I hadn't texted, hadn't planned to stop by, but the lights were on, and the porch was glowing with that golden hue her place always seemed to wear after sunset. I sat there in the van for a few minutes, debating whether to knock or drive away. Before I could decide, the front door opened, and there she was, barefoot again, holding a mug of tea like she knew I was coming. She waved me in, said nothing, and just left the door open. That night, we sat on her back porch, wrapped in old flannel blankets, watching the stars blink into existence. She poured us both some of that too-bitter tea she liked, and we didn't bother pretending it tasted good. She told me about her garden plans for the spring, even though she said she probably wouldn't follow through. I told her she should grow lavender, that it suited her quiet, strong, and capable of healing. Without asking for thanks, she didn't respond right away, just stared at the sky and whispered, "No one's ever said that about me before." It was around that moment, maybe a beat or two after, that the air changed. Not dramatically. Nothing cinematic. Just a shift. A tension neither of us reached for, but neither of us pulled away from. I didn't touch her. She didn't lean in. But the distance between us suddenly felt electric, like any movement would tip the balance. And then, just like that, it passed. She yawned, stood up, and said she needed to finish something before bed. I nodded, stood too, and told her I should head out. We didn't hug. We didn't linger. But as I reached the gate, she called out softly behind me, "Jay." I turned. She hesitated, eyes shadowed by the porch light behind her. "Thank you for showing up when you didn't have to." I drove home that night with a knot in my stomach, not from confusion or regret, but from recognition. I was starting to fall for someone who wasn't asking me to. Someone who never once hinted at needing anything more than conversation and the occasional car check. And maybe that's what made it feel real. It wasn't a whirlwind. It was a slow bloom in winter. Over the next week, I got busy. Work picked up, calls started coming in, and I let the days stack up without visiting her. She didn't text, and I didn't either. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had read into it too much. But the part of me that missed her, that replayed her laughter and the sound of her saying my name, told me I hadn't. Then, out of nowhere, she called. Her voice was steady but quiet. The radio's acting up again. "I know it's nothing, but I was hoping you'd stop by." I told her I'd be there first thing the next morning. She paused, then added, "I bought muffins. Figured you might be hungry." That simple invitation felt heavier than any declaration of love. It meant she missed me too. It meant this wasn't one-sided. And it meant I was driving back into something real. The kind of real that doesn't need a name. Not yet. The next morning, the sky was heavy with clouds, casting the whole town in a grayish filter that made everything look a little more fragile. I pulled into her driveway just after 8, earlier than usual, though I hadn't slept much the night before. Something about her voice on the phone had lingered with me long after I hung up. It wasn't just what she said it was how she said it, like she'd rehearsed the line a few times before calling, like asking me to come over had cost her more than she let on. I stepped out of the van and was met by the familiar creak of her porch steps and the quiet thud of the screen door closing behind her. She stood there with a knit cardigan pulled tight around her, hair still damp from the shower. No makeup, no pretense. There was a softness in her face I hadn't seen before, not the guarded softness of someone trying to appear open, but the quiet surrender of someone who had stopped pretending they weren't waiting for you. She held a brown paper bag in one, hand in motion for me to come in. I followed without a word, brushing my hands on my jeans out of habit. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. A quiet jazz instrumental hummed from a speaker somewhere near the bookshelf. And the living room had been tidied up in a way that felt deliberate, not showroom neat, but intentional, as if she wanted to be seen at her best without trying too hard. On the coffee table, she'd placed 2 ceramic plates and a small bowl of butter, as if breakfast with me had been a real plan, not just an excuse. I took a seat on the floor again, same spot as before, and she joined me, sliding the bag between us and revealing a pair of oversized muffins that looked homemade, even if they weren't. We didn't talk right away. There was something about the moment that didn't require language. We just ate silently, each bite marking the quiet kind of intimacy that forms when 2 people are no longer strangers and not yet anything else. When we were halfway through, she finally looked up and said, barely louder than a whisper, that she'd had a dream the night before. In it, she was 20 again, driving the coast with the windows down and music blasting, hair whipping in the wind. She said the dream wasn't sad, but waking up had been. That's when I realized what had really brought me here today. It wasn't the car radio. It was something she couldn't fix on her own, something unspoken that had crept in during the days we'd spent apart. After we cleaned up, she asked me to take a look at the radio, though we both knew it wasn't broken. I slid into the driver's seat, fiddled with the dials, and heard the soft crackle before the music came through clear. It was a classic soul station, the kind that played songs with real horns and verses that meant something. She stood just outside the open door, one hand resting on the frame, her eyes flicking between me and the dashboard like she was searching for something. That's when the song changed, and a slow ballad started playing, one of those tracks that makes time feel slower than it is. And then, as if carried by the music itself, she said it. I haven't let anyone get this close in a long time. Wasn't a confession. It wasn't a warning. It was a simple truth spoken without armor. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her. At the tiny crow's feet near her eyes, the faded scar near her left eyebrow, the way her lips pressed together like they were holding back 1,000 thoughts. She was beautiful, not in the filtered way people toss around online, but in the honest way that beauty becomes when someone has lived through enough to stop faking it. I stepped out of the car, letting the radio play behind me, and stood beside her. We didn't touch. We didn't lean in. Just stood there, the music playing low, the morning stretching out quietly around us. In that silence, I realized how easy it would be to cross the line, to reach out, to close the distance. But something about the stillness told me not yet. That if this thing between us was real, it deserved more than a moment of impulse. It needed care, it needed time. We went back inside and spent the rest of the morning not doing much at all. She showed me a few short stories she had written and never published, scribbled in notebooks with dog-eared pages. I listened as she read. One out loud, her voice steady but hesitant, as if waiting for me to laugh at the wrong part or lose interest. I didn't. The story was about a woman who drove across the desert to escape a life she didn't hate but didn't want anymore. It was sad and slow and full of heat. I told her it reminded me of her, and she just smiled without meeting my eyes. Later, I offered to make lunch and she let me, even though she teased me about not knowing how to cook anything beyond grilled cheese. We made sandwiches, sliced apples, and sat on the kitchen floor like kids hiding from responsibility. I told her about a time I got caught stealing gum from a gas station when I was 13, and how my mom made me go back, apologize, and work there for a week as punishment. She told me about the time she tried to cut her own bangs during a breakup and ended up looking like she lost a bet with a hedge trimmer. These weren't deep, life-altering confessions, but they mattered. Built something between us brick by brick. When I finally stood to leave, the sun was already dipping low. She walked me to the door again, but this time there was a different weight in the air, a pause that wasn't there before. I turned to say goodbye, and that's when she did something unexpected. She reached out, just briefly, and touched my wrist, not my hand, not a hug. It's just that small, deliberate touch. It was enough. More than enough. Driving home, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence ride with me, the ghost of her touch lingering like a secret I didn't want to share with the world just yet. I knew then that we had stepped onto a path we couldn't pretend not to see anymore. And whether we walked it as friends, as something more, or somewhere in between, we were walking it together now. The following days passed with a strange mixture of anticipation and restraint. I didn't text her that night, and she didn't call the next morning. But the silence didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like a breath between words, a natural pause. Like we were both sitting with what had just happened, afraid to name it too quickly and risk watching it vanish under the pressure of expectation. Her touch on my wrist had been nothing more than a moment, a second, a whisper. But it carried a weight I hadn't expected. And when I closed my eyes that night, it wasn't the softness of her skin I remembered. It was the quiet decision behind it. The choice to reach out, however briefly. After years of pulling away from everyone, that week I kept busy, but my thoughts kept returning to her. I caught myself rereading our old messages, remembering the way she laughed when I overbuttered my toast, or how she gently rolled her eyes whenever I parked slightly crooked in her driveway. It wasn't grand gestures that stuck with MIT, was the small things, the quiet kindness, the effortless way she made space for me in her world without asking for anything in return. And that scared me a little, because somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing this as casual. I was no longer showing up to fix a car. I was showing up because not being near her had started to feel like something was missing. On Friday afternoon, she texted me a photo of her cat tangled in a string. Of holiday lights, the caption simple: "He tried redecorating. It's not going well." I smiled without meaning to. That's all it took, one photo and a line of dry humor, and suddenly the distance between us evaporated. I responded with a laughing emoji and said I'd be over Saturday with proper supplies. To help untangle the mess, she replied, "Bring patience. And maybe a fire extinguisher." When I showed up the next day, she opened the door with her usual half smirk and a flicker of something else in her eyes, something warmer. She stepped aside to let me in, her hair still damp from a shower and her oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder. It looked effortless, but I knew her well enough now to understand she'd chosen that look on purpose. Don't to impress, but to feel comfortable around me. That realization stirred something deep in my chest. The cat meowed dramatically. From the armchair, as if complaining about being the punchline to a joke he hadn't signed up for, I knelt to inspect the tangled lights, but she handed me a cup of hot cider before I could even start. "Bribe for your labor," she said, and I took it without protest. We spent the next hour laughing as we tried to detangle the lights. Somehow, they knotted themselves in ways that defied physics, and every time we made progress, the cat decided to leap back into the chaos, undoing our efforts. It was ridiculous, borderline slapstick, and by the time we finally got the lights sorted, we were both on the floor, breathless with laughter. I hadn't laughed like that in a long time. It's a kind of laughter that didn't come from something funny, but from feeling so utterly at ease with someone that even failure became a joy to share. Afterward, she sat on her couch, legs folded beneath us, sipping the last of the cider and watching the lights blink gently from the windowsill. It had started to rain outside, the soft kind of drizzle that made the world seem quieter, more insulated. She leaned her head back against the cushions and exhaled. And I realized then that she looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, like someone who had spent years carrying too much and had only just begun to set it down. She turned her head to look at me then, her eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them. "You're good at this," she said softly. Almost like it was a secret she was only just now allowing herself to share. "At what?" I asked, voice low. "At being here?" Not making me feel like I have to explain everything. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I reached for her hand. Not boldly, not to make a move, but gently. Like returning something that had been misplaced, she didn't flinch. Her fingers curled around mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. We sat like that for a long while, not talking, just existing in the same space. Our hands intertwined and our hearts beating a little louder in the quiet. Eventually, the conversation drifted again. She told me about the first car she ever owned, a beat-up hatchback that only played cassette tapes, saying how she used to drive it out to the beach alone when she needed to think. I told her about my high school shop teacher, the one who believed in me even when I didn't know what I was doing. These stories came easy now, like we were flipping through pages of old books we hadn't read in years, rediscovering the parts that still mattered. The sky outside darkened early, as it always does in the colder months, and she lit a few candles. Without saying much, the room glowed in that flickering, golden way that made everything feel more intimate, more honest. I stood to go after another hour, knowing that staying too long might push the boundaries we still hadn't fully defined. But before I could reach the door, she stopped me. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice almost lost beneath the crackle of the candle wick. I looked at her, really looked, and I knew in that instant that something had shifted again. We weren't just circling around a connection anymore. We were standing at the edge of it, deciding whether to step in or pull back. I nodded, stepped away from the door, and sat back down beside her. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time, we let ourselves be quiet together without needing a reason. Later, as she drifted off to sleep beside me on the couch, the rain still tapping gently against the windows, I thought about how fragile beginnings can be. How easy it is to break something before it ever has a chance to bloom. But I also thought about strength, the quiet kind that looks like patience, like trust, like choosing not to rush the moment just because your heart is racing faster than your mind can keep up. She stirred once, murmuring something I didn't catch, and shifted closer. I stayed still, careful not to wake her, letting the sound of her breathing anchor me to the moment. This whatever it was wasn't perfect. Wasn't labeled or certain or even clearly defined, but it was real. Sometimes real is more than enough. Morning arrived gently, with the soft light of dawn slipping through the blinds and casting faint golden lines across the room. I woke before she did, still seated awkwardly against the couch's armrest, my neck stiff and one foot asleep. But I didn't move, not right away. Eloise was curled beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, one arm draped loosely across her own waist. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, in that rare way you only see when someone's truly let go, even just for a little while. And in that quiet morning hush, I felt a kind of calm I hadn't known in years. It wasn't the dramatic kind of awakening you read about in books, the grand epiphany that flips your world upside down. It was quieter, simpler. Just a moment where everything felt okay, where nothing needed to be explained or justified or worried about. We were just there, together, without masks, without performance. Eventually I shifted slowly, trying not to wake her. I stretched out my legs and stood, joints cracking, and stepped carefully toward the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. The act felt intimate, like trespassing and being invited in at the same time. I moved quietly, trying to keep the normalcy of morning intact. Her house still carried that lived-in warmth, blankets tossed over chairs, a cup left on the counter from yesterday, a slightly ajar cabinet that never quite closed right. It felt like a place that belonged to someone who'd spent a lot of time alone but had recently started letting someone else's rhythm mix in with her own as the coffee brewed. The familiar rich scent began to fill the air, mingling with the faint traces of lavender that lingered on her pillows and the soft smell of rain still clinging to the windows. I stood in the doorway for a moment, sipping from a chipped mug she had likely used 100 times, and watched as she stirred beneath the blanket on the couch. Her eyes blinked open slowly, not with panic or confusion, but with the gentle recognition that sometimes follows a dreamless sleep. She sat up, rubbed the sleep from her face, and offered me a tired but genuine smile. That smile lingered. It followed me through the rest of the morning as we moved carefully around each other in the kitchen, passing plates, pouring coffee, exchanging soft words without overanalyzing the previous night. There was no dramatic conversation, no immediate attempt to define what we were or where this was going. And oddly, that felt like the healthiest thing. We let the space breathe. We let ourselves breathe, but later that morning, as I gathered my things to leave, I could feel the weight of unspoken things starting to press down on us. We were towing the line now, just emotionally but physically. And boundaries, when blurred, have a way of demanding acknowledgement. She walked me to the door, as she always did, but this time she didn't stay on the threshold. She stepped out with me, barefoot on the concrete, arms crossed in that self-protective way I was. Beginning to recognize, she stared out at the street for a moment before speaking, and when she did, her voice was low and careful, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping animal. "This is starting to feel like something, isn't it?" It was the first time either of us had put weight to it. The first time the feelings we'd been letting grow in silence were asked to stand up and be counted. I nodded, unsure of what else to do. I didn't want to scare her by saying too much, and I didn't want to lie by saying less. She looked at me for a long moment, searching my face like she was trying to read the subtext of every small expression. And then she said something that caught me off guard, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. "I don't know if I'm ready for anything again, but I also don't want to lose this." It was the kind of sentence that people usually dress up or dance around, but she said it plainly, like truth deserved its own space, even if it was messy. I appreciated that more than she knew. I told her I didn't need anything from her, not yet. That this wasn't about rushing into something or putting labels on a connection still forming. I just wanted to keep showing up, that was all. She didn't respond with words, just reached out and touched my hand again, briefly, a grounding gesture, and with that I left. The drive home was quiet, no music, just the soft hum of the engine and my own thoughts spiraling out in every direction. I knew things had shifted now. The dance we had been doing of flirtation, half camaraderie, was starting to demand more intentional steps, and with that came risk, real risk, of hurting her, being hurt. But there was also the chance of something honest, something deep. Over the next few days, we texted, but not as much. There was a sense of space now, a pause in our rhythm. Could feel her retreat slightly, not out of coldness, but self-preservation. I didn't push. Instead, I poured myself into work, caught up on overdue projects, and let the silence be what it was. Sometimes caring means giving someone the room they're afraid to ask for. Then one evening, 4 days later, she called. Not a text, not a voice note, a real call. Her voice was softer than usual, and I could hear a bit of background noise TV. Maybe, or a fan. She asked if I was free for dinner that weekend. Nothing more. No explanation. I said yes. Didn't talk about the previous morning or the feelings we'd laid bare. Just talked about food and what time I should come. Bye. And that simplicity, that gentle return to normalcy, felt like the best possible outcome. Saturday arrived, and when I got to her place, I found the table set for 2 candles lit, music playing low. She greeted me with a hug, this time a real one, warm, certain, held a little too long to be casual. The meal was simple pasta salad, a bottle of red wine, but it felt like a celebration. Not of romance, not of conclusions, but of a chapter still being written. We talked about books, about her work, about a funny podcast she'd started listening to. We laughed like we used to. And when the meal was done, we stayed at the table. Still talking, letting the candle burn low between us. There was no big gesture, no kiss, no proclamation of love. But there was comfort, and maybe that was the point. Love doesn't always arrive with a banner. Sometimes it shows up as presence, as willingness, as 2 people choosing, again and again, to be in the same room when they could just as easily walk away as I left that night. She walked me to the door again, and just before I turned to go, she touched my shoulder and said, "Thank you for being patient with me." I meant it when I said, "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed felt like the slow turning of a page, as if we were both reading a story neither of us had written, but were somehow still responsible for. Eloise and I didn't talk every day, but when we did, the conversations had a softness. To them, like the way a blanket warms you after sitting too long in the cold. There was no rush to define what we were or what we were doing. Instead, there was presence, attention, a quiet commitment to simply not letting the thread between us fray. She texted me pictures of meals she'd tried cooking, even the burnt ones. I sent her videos of my half-failed woodworking projects, and we traded gentle sarcasm like currency between us. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was steady. Steadier than anything I'd felt in a long time. One afternoon, about a week after our quiet dinner together, she invited me over again, not for any repair, not under the guise of a favor, just to spend time. It was a Sunday, and the air had that crisp, early spring chill to it that made the world feel cleaner, fresher, and just slightly more alive. I arrived with a bag of groceries, a gesture I hoped would signal I wasn't there to take from her, but to give something back. She opened the door with a sleepy smile, hair in a loose braid, and a sweatshirt too big for her frame. And there was something about that Imogen-filtered, unprepared, that etched itself in my mind like a photograph. I didn't want to lose. We spent the afternoon cooking, or more accurately, trying to cook. We chose a complicated recipe neither of us had attempted before, and halfway through, we realized we were missing two essential ingredients. But instead of frustration, it led to laughter and improvisation. She danced around the kitchen in her socks, holding a wooden spoon like a microphone, singing along to a playlist that bounced between 80s pop and slow jazz. I couldn't remember the last time I felt so at ease, so welcomed into someone else's rhythm. We burned the sauce, undercooked the pasta, and ended up eating peanut butter sandwiches on the couch instead. But it felt like a feast. After lunch, we sat outside in her backyard, a modest patch of grass lined with flower beds that had only just begun to bloom. The sun warmed our faces as we sipped lukewarm coffee and listened to birds rustling in the trees. Eloise told me about her mother's garden, how as a child she'd been forced to help weed it every weekend and hated every minute of it. Now, she said, she missed those days more than she could admit. I told her about my grandfather's old truck, the one that gave me my first real mechanical challenge and nearly made me quit fixing cars altogether. These stories weren't milestones. They weren't grand, transformative moments.
But they
mattered. They were bricks in the slow-building wall of trust we were assembling, one shared memory at a time. There were pauses, course-long silences between topics where neither of us felt the need to fill the air. Those silences had shifted over time. They were no longer awkward. They were peaceful. I noticed then how much space she had made for me in her life, not just in her schedule or her home, but in her energy. She had shifted from guarded to open, not completely, but enough for me to feel the difference. The way she lingered when we hugged. The way she let her eyes stay on mine a few seconds longer. These were the cues she gave. I paid attention to them like signposts in unfamiliar territory. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind picked up a chill, she invited me to stay for dinner again. This time, we ordered takeout. No more cooking experiments. Just two people, paper boxes on their laps, laughing about the local restaurant's poor attempts at spice. At one point, she reached over without thinking and brushed a piece of lint from my shirt, small domestic gesture, but one that felt loaded with significance. She caught herself mid-motion and withdrew quickly, then smiled nervously, almost apologetically. I didn't make it awkward. I just smiled back and leaned slightly closer. After dinner, we moved to the living room. She brought out a stack of old photo albums and, unexpected choice and, began flipping through them with casual commentary. Photos of her at different stages. A teenager with too much eyeliner, a college student with short, jagged hair, a young mother holding her daughter, in a hospital bed. She spoke about her past in the way people do when they've made peace with it, not proud of everything, not ashamed, just honest. When she landed on a picture of herself in her mid-30s, standing next to her ex-husband, she paused. Finger hovered over the image for a moment before she said quietly that they hadn't been happy for a long time before the end. That sometimes people stay not because of love, but because of inertia. It was the first time she had spoken about him directly. I didn't push, didn't ask questions. I let her speak, let her shape the narrative in her own time. And when she set the album down and looked at me, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Vulnerability, yes, but also trust. like she had offered me a key to a room most people never got to see. We ended the night with a movie, one of those light-hearted romantic comedies that neither of us really paid attention to. Her head rested against my shoulder, and my arm curled instinctively around her. It wasn't about romance, not in that moment. It was about comfort, safety, proximity. When the credits rolled, we sat there a little longer, unwilling to break the spell just yet, when it was finally time to leave. We stood by the door again, the ritual now so familiar it felt like a rhythm of its own. She didn't speak as I put on my jacket. She just looked at me with that same unreadable expression she often wore when she was caught between her heart and her fear. Then, in a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable, she stepped forward and hugged me, not the careful kind of hug we'd shared before, but a real one. Firm, full-bodied, head against chest, arms locked tight. I held her back with equal intensity, and neither of us moved for a long time. She pulled back first, eyes a little wet, but smiling. "You feel safe?" she said quietly. It wasn't a compliment, it was a revelation. As I drove home that night, something inside me shifted. Again. This wasn't casual anymore. This wasn't temporary. Whatever we were building, it had roots now. And even though we hadn't said the words out loud, I knew we were no longer pretending we didn't care. We were caring, fully, deeply, and maybe even dangerously. The days that followed didn't come with fireworks or declarations or big cinematic moments. Instead, they brought quiet consistency, like the slow layering of sediment at the bottom of a river, building something solid. Beneath the surface, I kept showing up. Sometimes that meant a text in the morning asking how she slept. Sometimes it meant a phone call on my drive home from work just to hear her voice. Sometimes it meant nothing at all, just the invisible presence of knowing. Someone was out there thinking of you, even in silence. I could feel that same presence from her too. Eloise wasn't the type to pour her heart out all at once, but she had found her own ways of reaching toward me. The coffee mug she set aside. For me, in her cupboard, was the playlist she sent, claiming it was accidentally your vibe. The small bag of my favorite roasted almonds she left on the passenger seat of my truck the last time I was over. No note, just there. But something shifted again in late March. Subtle at first. She became more reserved, her messages shorter, her voice quieter on the phone. I didn't take it personally, not at first. I assumed she was busy, tired, preoccupied with work, or her daughter's upcoming spring break. Still, I felt the shift. The energy between us became more careful, like she was stepping lightly across a floor she feared might give out beneath her. I gave her space, the kind that isn't retreat but respect. I still messaged her, just less frequently. I wanted her to know I hadn't disappeared, but I also didn't want to crowd her. If she was sinking into something she needed to process alone, then came a Saturday that broke the pattern. I had just come back from a long job in the next town over, my hands still stained with oil, my limbs sore from hours under a car that refused to cooperate. I was halfway through washing up when I saw her name flash across my phone. No text, just a missed call. I called her back immediately, and she answered on the second ring, her voice fragile in a way I hadn't heard before. She didn't ask me to come over. She didn't need to. I was already grabbing my keys before she finished, saying she didn't want to be alone. When I got there, she was sitting on the back steps, wrapped in a gray cardigan that swallowed her shoulders. Her face was bare, not just of makeup but of expression, like someone who'd been fighting off a storm and finally let it in. I sat beside her without saying anything, our knees brushing, our breathing falling into the same rhythm. After a long pause, she told me what had happened. Her ex-husband had called out of nowhere, wanting to talk about revisiting things now that they were both older, supposedly wiser. He had said things that confused her, not because she still wanted him, but because he was part of a life she had built and then lost. God. And that kind of echo has a way of stirring up everything you thought was settled. He had always had a way of making her feel uncertain. The ground beneath her started to shake again. She told me she felt selfish for letting his words affect her, that she hated how easily doubt crept back in. Even after all this time, I didn't try to fix it. I didn't offer her the easy platitudes people toss around when they're uncomfortable with pain. I just listened, really listened. And when she was done talking, when the silence between us settled in like dust after a storm, I said the only thing that felt true. You're allowed to feel all of it. None of it makes you weak. That was when she broke. Not into sobs, but into that quiet, restrained kind of crying that says, I've been holding this for too long. I wrapped an arm around her and she leaned into me without hesitation, like a branch finally bending under its own weight. We stayed like that for a while, the evening air growing colder around us, the neighborhood slipping into its usual dusk hush. When she finally pulled away, she looked at me like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Her lips parted, then closed again. Instead, she reached out, took my hand, and guided me back inside. That night, we didn't sit on opposite ends of the couch. We didn't avoid touch. Curled up together under a blanket, her head resting against my chest, my hand stroking gentle circles along her back. And in that space, something changed, not rushed, not forced, but acknowledged. She fell asleep like that, wrapped in warmth, and I stayed awake long enough to memorize the moment. The way her fingers remained lightly intertwined with mine even in sleep. The way her breath deepened slowly, steadily, as if this was the first time in a long while she had allowed herself to truly rest. The next morning, she made pancakes, terrible ones, flat and slightly burned, and we ate them anyway, laughing at the mess. She wore one of my old sweatshirts, and when I teased her about it, she told me to be grateful she hadn't cut it in two. A crop top. We didn't talk about the night before. We didn't need to. It had already become a part of our shared language, a sentence we'd both read and understood without needing to repeat. But as the week unfolded, I could still see the shadows flickering at the edges of her confidence. Moments when she'd withdraw mid-sentence or go quiet for no reason. The thing about healing is that it's never linear. You can have the most beautiful day and still fall apart the next. And loving someone who's been broken doesn't mean fixing them, it means sitting with them while they rebuild, piece by piece without rushing the process. So that's what I did. I kept showing up, not with flowers or grand speeches, but with presence, with patience, with a steadiness that didn't demand anything in return. It was midweek when she called again, this time just to talk. We stayed on the phone for over an hour, no particular topic, just the easy rhythm of companionship. At one point, she said, I keep expecting you to change your mind. I asked her what she meant. About me, she said. Most people don't stay this long once they realize I'm not simple. I told her the truth, that it wasn't about staying or leaving. It was about choosing, and I had chosen her. It's not because she was easy, but because she was real. And for the first time since we'd met, she didn't respond with deflection or humor. She just said, okay, soft, shaky, and full of more meaning. Then the longest speech. When Eloise suggested the weekend trip, it caught me off guard, not because I didn't want to go, but because it felt like a step forward neither of us had voiced yet. We'd grown comfortable within our shared bubble, her house, the late-night calls, the slow unwinding of emotional threads within the same few square feet. But a trip meant new terrain, test, in some ways. Could what we were building survive? Outside the gentle parameters we'd quietly drawn around ourselves. Still, I said yes before she could second-guess the offer. The plan was simple. A drive up to a lakeside town a few hours away where her cousin owned a small cabin. Just a change of scenery, she said. Nothing big, but even in her voice I could hear it something hopeful threading through the caution. We left on a Friday morning under a cloudless sky, the kind that made the roads look like they went on forever. She packed snacks, a playlist, and a book she knew she'd never finish. Handled the drive, watching her as much as the road, studying how she sat, legs tucked under her, hair tied up messily, sunglasses perched slightly crooked. She looked relaxed, but there was a restlessness just under the surface. I didn't press. I let the hum of the road and the rhythm of the wind do most of the talking. For a while it was enough. Somewhere between towns, we stopped for coffee, a small roadside diner with faded signs and dusty booths. She wandered inside ahead of me, smiling at something on her phone, and for a moment, I saw her as someone else, Mita, woman in her prime, self-contained, elegant without trying to be. The waitress called her Hun, and she chuckled like she'd been called that all her life. We sat by the window and watched trucks pass by while we sipped overly sweet coffee and split a slice of pie neither of us needed. It was unremarkable in a way, but that's what made it perfect. Sometimes the most important moments arrive dressed in ordinariness. Back on the road, the conversation deepened. She spoke about her daughter, about the early days of motherhood, and the way her world had shrunk and expanded at the same time. She told me about the jobs she'd taken just to keep the lights on, the sacrifices no one applauded, the loneliness that sometimes clung to her even in a full room. I listened. Not because I had answers, but because I knew she needed her story held by someone who wouldn't flinch. I shared too about my father's silence growing up. The accident that changed how I looked at time, the reasons I sometimes disappeared into work longer than I should. We didn't fix each other. We just made space. And that, more than anything, felt like progress. We arrived at the cabin by late afternoon. It sat nestled among tall trees, with a wraparound porch and a view of the lake that stretched out like glass. The inside was simple: wood-paneled walls, a fireplace, mismatched furniture that felt lived in. She seemed nervous at first, suddenly uncertain in a space neither of us controlled. I unpacked while she walked the perimeter, touching the railing, adjusting a curtain, orienting herself. Eventually she returned to the porch and sat cross-legged on the swing, eyes fixed on the horizon. Dinner was grilled vegetables, toasted bread, and wine from a bottle with a ripped label. We ate in comfortable silence as dusk wrapped itself around the cabin, the air turning cooler. She lit candles inside while I tended to the fire pit outside. When she stepped out to join me, wrapped in a blanket and carrying 2 mugs of something warm, I realized how far we'd come. This wasn't a date. This wasn't a getaway. This was 2 people slowly deciding to let each other be seen in the absence of routine. That night, the lake reflected the stars so clearly it felt like we were surrounded on all sides. We sat by the fire until the wood turned to glowing embers, talking about everything and nothing, old crushes, bad dates, dreams, too embarrassing to share with anyone else. She laughed until she cried when I told her about my disastrous first kiss, and I smiled watching her whole body light up in amusement. The kind of joy that doesn't ask for permission. Eventually, it got too cold to stay outside. Inside, the cabin held a different quiet one filled with potential and risk. There was only one bed, and the couch was an option, sure, but we both knew that wasn't where the night was heading. She disappeared into the bathroom for a while, and when she returned, she wore an oversized shirt and no makeup, her vulnerability obvious and unshielded. I had changed into sweats and a shirt, trying to look casual, but feeling anything but. She climbed into bed first, pulling the covers around her and turning on her side to face the wall. I slid in beside her, careful not to crowd, but also not pretending we weren't aware of each other's presence. For several minutes, there was only breathing hers, steady and slow, and mine shallow with anticipation. Then she spoke barely. Above a whisper, "This scares me." I turned toward her, but I didn't reach out yet. "I know," I said, "me too." She rolled onto her back and stared at the ceiling. "Not because I don't want this," she continued, "but because I do, and wanting something that much. It's dangerous." I understood. The more something matters, the more it can hurt you. I moved closer then, slow and certain, placing a hand lightly on her arm. "Then we'll take it one breath at a time," I said. And she nodded, eyes still on the ceiling, but her hand reached for mine beneath the covers, fingers curling gently around my wrist. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't need to. There was intimacy in the way our bodies fit beside each other, in the way our hands stayed joined, in the stillness that was anything but empty. When morning came, she was still there, her head on my chest, breath warm against my skin. Outside, birds stirred in the trees, and the lake glimmered in the early light. Inside, nothing had broken, nothing had fallen apart. We had crossed a threshold, quietly and together. Over breakfast, she was quieter than usual, but not distant. Reflective, maybe. Like someone trying to reconcile the past with the present. I didn't push. We packed up slowly, not wanting to admit the trip was ending. On the drive home, she reached over and rested her hand on my thigh without looking at me, holding it there for miles. That single act, that wordless confirmation, said everything we couldn't quite say yet out loud. When we returned to her driveway, and I helped carry her things inside, the familiarity of her home felt different now. Not less, just altered, like something had shifted and settled at the same time. We didn't talk about the trip. We didn't name what had happened. But in the days that followed, something between us quieted in a way that didn't mean distance. It meant trust. The return from the lake cabin brought a strange kind of stillness, the kind that settles in after a storm, not destructive, but deeply altering. Something had shifted between us that weekend, a silent agreement neither of us had said out loud but both clearly understood. In the days that followed, there were no declarations, no rushed decisions. We didn't label anything, and there were no questions like, "What are we now?" But our energy had changed. There was a softness to how she looked at me when I walked through her front door now, a quiet certainty in the way she poured 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. She began to leave little things undone, like dishes in the sink or books stacked beside the couch, not out of neglect, but as a sign she no longer felt the need to maintain the pristine version of herself. It was an invitation to see her real, uncurated, and in return, I brought more of my life into her space, to my boots by her door, my thermos left in her kitchen, a hoodie she borrowed and never gave back. But with that closeness came the slow return of something else, the outside world. Friends began asking her questions, not nosy or judgmental, just curious. They'd seen us out grocery shopping together, or noticed how her phone lit up with my name more than usual. Her sister sent a message one afternoon with a single winking emoji and the words, "So, who's the mechanic?" She showed it to me, laughing at first, but there was tension in her shoulders, a flicker of something wary behind her eyes. I asked if it bothered her, and she shook her head, but her voice said otherwise. "I just don't want to explain something I'm still trying to understand," she said. "I got it. Naming something too early can kill it, like touching a butterfly's wings before it's ready to fly." So I let it be. My own world started to take notice too. It's one of my regular clients, an older man who ran a part shop downtown, asked if I was seeing someone. When I didn't deny it, he nodded slowly and said, "Good for you. Just make sure you're both carrying the weight. One-sided love is heavier than it looks." His words stuck with me. Not because I doubted Eloise's feelings, but because I knew how hard it was for her to let someone else carry anything for her at all. One Thursday evening, she invited me to dinner at her place. It was just the 2 of us again, but something about the air felt different, more formal, slightly rehearsed. She'd cooked instead of ordering out, lit candles instead of the usual overhead lights. We sat at the table instead of the couch, like we were performing a version of something we hadn't done before. The food was great, her laugh as effortless as always, but I could feel her mind elsewhere. Halfway through the meal, she set down her fork and said, "My daughter's coming home next weekend." I nodded. I'd known it was coming, but the way she said it felt like a preamble to something heavier. "I haven't told her about you," she added after a beat. "Not really. I mean, she knows someone's around, but I didn't want to confuse her unless I was sure." I didn't ask her if she was sure now. I didn't put that weight on her. Instead, I said, "Whatever you need this to look like, I'll follow your lead." She smiled at that, grateful and maybe a little sad, and we finished our meal without another word about it. That weekend, she grew quieter. She didn't cancel plans, but she pulled inward in subtle ways, shorter texts, delayed responses, long pauses during our calls. I understood the pattern. Her daughter coming back home represented more than just a change in schedule. A reality check, a reminder that the life she had been slowly building with me existed within a much larger framework, one that involved history, responsibility, and a person she loved more fiercely than anyone else. I didn't take it personally, or at least I tried not to. I kept showing up, even if just through small gestures, dropping off coffee on her porch early in the morning, fixing the broken latch on her kitchen window without being asked, leaving a note in her mailbox that simply read, "I'm still." Here, when her daughter finally returned, I gave them space. I didn't visit that weekend, didn't call unless she reached out first. But on Sunday night, I got a message. She asked about you. She said I smile differently when I talk about you. I didn't reply right away. I stared at the message, heart thudding. And when I finally did respond, all I wrote was, "And what did you tell her?" She replied, "That you're kind and steady, and that I'm scared because I think this matters more than I thought it would." That was the first time she'd admitted anything close to what I'd been feeling for weeks. A few days later, she invited me to meet her daughter, just casually, nothing serious, at a small farmer's market on the edge of town. It wasn't framed as a big introduction, but we both knew it was a threshold. When I arrived, Eloise looked composed, but I could tell she was wound tight underneath. Her daughter Mia was everything I expected sharp-eyed, a bit reserved, with her mother's quiet strength. We spoke politely, nothing forced, and after an hour or so, Mia pulled Eloise aside while I waited by a flower stall. When they returned, Mia gave me a small nod. Not approval, not exactly, but a beginning. After that, the rhythm between us began to shift again. Slowly, cautiously, she let me into more parts of her life, the messy, real ones. I was there when the sink clogged again, and she didn't apologize for the dirty dishes. I was there when she got overwhelmed with work and snapped at me for something small, only to apologize later with a kind of rawness that made it clear she was terrified of becoming difficult to love. And I was there the night she confessed, tearfully, that she didn't know how to do this, be with someone without waiting for it to fall apart. I held her through that, not with promises or fixes, but with the steady kind of love that says, "You don't have to know. I'm not leaving." Outside pressures didn't stop, but they started to matter less. Friends continued to ask. Family whispered questions. But as time passed, the weight of those voices grew quieter beneath the sound of our shared days. The creak of her floorboards, the click of my truck door, the hum of our evenings together. Love, I was learning, didn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it grew slowly, insistently, like ivy up a brick wall, quiet, strong, and impossible to ignore. Spring drifted into early summer, and with it came warmth that made everything feel lighter on the surface, even if life beneath it still moved in quiet, complicated patterns. The days grew longer, the evenings more golden, and Eloise and I settled into a kind of rhythm that felt almost domestic in its simplicity. On Tuesday nights, I cooked. On Saturday mornings, she made coffee and we'd sit out back with our feet up, watching birds hop across the fence. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, rooted in the kind of daily grace that comes from choosing each other again and again. But as often happens when you finally stop holding your breath, life finds a way to knock the wind out of you again. It started with a letter. A plain white envelope slipped into her mailbox, addressed in a handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade. She didn't tell me right away. I noticed it in the shift of her moods, the way her eyes lingered on nothing, the way her smile started, coming with a second of delay. It took 3 days before she finally brought it up. We were in her kitchen, sunlight spilling across the tile. She was drying her hands on a towel when she said, "My mother wrote to me." She said it like she'd been practicing in her head, trying to make it sound less significant than it was. I didn't push. I just waited. She explained slowly that they hadn't spoken in years. Not since a fight that spiraled into silence, the kind of estrangement that grows roots the longer it's left alone. Her mother was in town, apparently, and wanted to meet for coffee. "Just coffee," Eloise said, but her voice was tight around the edges, her hands restless. I asked her what she wanted to do, and she said she didn't know. She said she was tired of holding grudges, but also tired of reopening old wounds. I understood. I'd had my own share of people who showed up too late and expected the door to still be open. But I also knew that sometimes closure doesn't come in the form of reconciliation. It comes from knowing you showed up anyway, even if the outcome remained the same. She eventually decided to go. She didn't ask me to come, and I didn't offer. Some battles are meant to be fought alone, and this was one of hers. When she returned later that evening, I could tell something had cracked open. Her eyes were red, but her posture was straighter, like she'd shed something heavy. She didn't talk much, only said it went. Okay, I let her be. We sat on the couch that night, not saying much, just being. And that silence, full and present, was enough. But the letter wasn't the only thing that stirred the waters. A few days later, I got a call from my brother, someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. Our relationship had always been strained, a constant tug-of-war between obligation and resentment. He was in town for a week and wanted to grab lunch. It felt like a test from the universe, both of us being pulled toward our pasts at the same time. I agreed mostly out of curiosity, and when I met him, the conversation was civil but guarded. He asked about work, about Dad, about whether I was still doing the whole fixing things gig. I mentioned Eloise, not by name at first, just said I was seeing someone. He raised an eyebrow, asked how serious it was, and then gave a low whistle when I said she was 42. Isn't that like 10 years older than you? He asked, and I shrugged. 11, actually. He laughed. Not unkindly, but in that way that suggested he couldn't quite take it seriously. It's man, he said. You always did go for. The unconventional, that comment stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. It's not because it offended me, but because it made me realize how invisible our world had been to the rest of mine. I had kept Eloise separate, not hidden, but protected. Part of that was her comfort, sure, but part of it was mine too. I had grown used to the bubble we'd built, untouched by judgment or comparison. And now that the edges were fraying, I felt exposed. That evening, we both shared our encounters with the past. Her mother, my brother. We sat across from each other on her porch, the sky painted in strokes of orange and lavender. And for the first time in weeks, it felt like there was distance between us. Not hostility, not even discomfort, but something unspoken that made everything feel just slightly out of sync. She looked at me and said, "Do you ever wonder what this looks like to other people?" I paused, then nodded. Sometimes. I care more about how it feels to us. She smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The following week brought more interruptions, or got hectic for both of us. I had 2 cars that needed engine replacements, and she had a deadline at the firm she occasionally consulted for. We were tired, busy, and distracted. Our conversations became shorter, more functional. We started skipping our usual nights together, and even when we did see each other, something felt muted, like we were both trying not to say the wrong thing. Then came the tipping point. One night, after a long day, I showed up at her place with takeout. I expected to find her relieved, maybe grateful for the break. Instead, she looked startled, not annoyed, just caught off guard. She let me in, and we sat down to eat. But the mood was off. Halfway through the meal, I finally asked, "Did I come at a bad time?" She hesitated, then said, "No. I didn't expect you tonight." I nodded, unsure of what to say. After a moment, she added, "Sometimes I feel like I'm not ready for this. For us. And I hate that, because I don't want to lose what we've built." It hurt. Not because I hadn't seen it coming, but because I had. I had felt her pulling back, inch by inch, and I had tried to hold on tighter, hoping it was just a phase. I didn't lash out. I didn't argue. I just said, "Tell me what you need." She looked down at her food, then back at me. A space, just a little, to think, to breathe, not to disappear, just to figure out if I'm choosing this for the right reasons. I nodded again, slower this time. "Okay," I said. "Take it." I left that night with a strange ache in my chest, a mix of sadness and understanding. I knew she wasn't pushing me away out of rejection. She was doing it because she respected what we had too much to let it become something uncertain, but it still hurt. I didn't sleep much that night. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if space meant goodbye, if silence would stretch too far. To bridge, even the quiet, patient kind, sometimes wasn't enough. The days that followed felt strange, like I'd stepped sideways into a life that looked the same but didn't feel quite right. I still woke up at the same hour, still brewed the same bitter coffee in the chipped mug I'd stopped minding. My tools were still lined up along the garage wall. My phone still buzzed with clients and work orders. and yet everything in me moved slower, quieter. There's a particular kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from restraint. Silence chosen out of respect, but that still echoes in every corner of your day. That's what this was. Eloise hadn't disappeared. She hadn't blocked me, hadn't ghosted or slammed the door. But the texts had stopped. The calls didn't come. And for the first time in months, I stopped driving up her street just because. It felt like home. I told myself to give her what she asked for: space. I knew that to love someone was to sometimes let go of your own need for reassurance, but that didn't make it easier. My hands were used to fixing broken things. Worn hoses, busted engines, warped panels. I could diagnose and mend those with a kind of instinct. But love? Doubt? Time apart? There were no parts to replace, no manuals to follow. Just the waiting, just the wondering. I started filling my evenings again with work, something I'd pulled away from in the weeks I'd been spending more time at her place. I took on extra clients, even helped out a friend with a restoration project that ate up entire weekends. The noise helped, the grease, the bolts, the tangibility of labor gave my thoughts somewhere else to land. But in the quiet hours late, at night or early morning, before the world stir-eyed, catch myself replaying everything. The trip to the cabin. The feel of her hand resting on mine in the middle of a crowd. The way she'd hum sometimes while folding laundry, not for anyone, just for herself. These little memories pressed into me like fingerprints on glass. Unavoidable. Present, after a week. I considered texting her. Nothing big, just to hope you're okay, or thinking of you. But every time I hovered over the keyboard, I'd hear her voice again, asking for space, asking to breathe. So I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch, even as it pulled at my ribs. I didn't know what her silence meant. Was she pulling away for good? Was she regretting ever letting me in? Or was she fighting something inside her, trying to decide if she was capable of holding something real without it slipping through her fingers? Then came the envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a water bill and a coupon catalog. No return address, but her handwriting was unmistakable. My name on the front, no flourish. Just Theo. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, afraid of what it might say. Afraid, too, of what it might not. Inside was a single piece of paper. No greeting, no sign-off. Just her words. I've been walking every evening since we last spoke, down the road, past the cemetery, through the little grove of trees you said reminded you of home. It's been helping. Not fixing, but helping. I keep thinking about the day we painted my porch railing, how you laughed when I got paint in my hair. I hated how close that moment felt, and I loved it too. That's what scares me. I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop. That if I lean too far into someone, they'll move. Or I will. But this time I didn't move, and neither did you. And that's worth holding on to. I'm not ready to come back yet, but I haven't left. Either I'm still here, just trying to believe in the ground beneath my feet. I read it 3 times. Then again, I folded the paper slowly and slid it back into the envelope like it might break if I wasn't careful. I didn't cry, but I felt something settle in. My chest a bittersweet warmth, a weight and a release all at once. She wasn't gone. She was just learning how to stay. And for the first time since she'd asked for distance, I exhaled without tension. That night, I didn't text her. But I wrote her back. I didn't overthink it. I didn't try to be poetic. I just told her what my days looked like. Nights felt colder. How I'd picked up her favorite tea even though she wasn't around to drink it. Okay? I told her I missed her voice, and the way she narrated the weather like it was something worth reciting. I told her I was still here too. The letter exchange became our rhythm. Every few days a new envelope, sometimes short, sometimes long. Sometimes filled with fragments of poems or lyrics that reminded her of us. Other times just lines like I saw a bluebird today. It felt like a sign. We didn't talk on the phone. We didn't see each other. But those letters became something sacred. a space where we could be honest without fear of interruption, without the pressure of instant response. And slowly, through ink and silence, we began to understand each other, better than we ever had in person. One afternoon, I got a letter that felt different. It was longer than usual, or structured. She talked about her childhood, about the first boy she loved, and how it ended without ceremony. About how her father's leaving had made her question permanence, even in the things that seemed immovable. She wrote about the time she tried to run away at 15 and only made it to the bus stop before realizing she had nowhere else to go. She said she'd always carried that girl inside Hertha, one who wanted to flee before the world could decide to let her down. But now she was trying to stand still, even when everything inside her wanted to bolt. That letter shook me, not because of what she'd confessed, but because I understood it. I'd never run physically, but emotionally, I'd built walls so high, even I couldn't see over them sometimes. I'd used work as armor, sarcasm as distance, independence as protection. But with her, those defenses had started to crumble, and it scared me too. I sat down that evening and began writing my longest letter yet. I told her about the night I thought I was going to lose her, not to someone else, but to herself. I wrote about the parts of her that scared me, the strength, the silence, the depth, and how I wasn't intimidated by them, just humbled. I told her that if she wanted to walk slow, I'd match her pace, that I didn't need a label or a plan, just a direction. Together, even if the road ahead stayed foggy, a week passed before I heard back. This time, there was no letter, just a knock at my door. I opened it to find her standing there. No suitcase, no plan, just her. Eyes were red, but her smile was clear. "I don't have the answers," she said, "but I don't want to figure them out alone." I didn't speak. I just stepped aside and let her in that silence full of choice, of return, of everything unspoken but deeply felt, was louder than any declaration we could have made. When she stepped back into my home that evening, the couch still slouched slightly in the middle, the fridge hummed that low, familiar note, the porch light flickered like it always did, but the air between us was newly fragile, like something precious being passed from one unsteady hand to another. I didn't rush to speak, and she didn't seem to need me to. Instead, she took a slow lap around the space, letting her fingers skim across the top of my kitchen counter, her gaze landing on the stack of letters she had written and I had kept in the drawer by the table, now laid out neatly, as if waiting for her return. When she reached the end of the room, she turned and offered a quiet kind of smile, not the radiant, unguarded kind from our earlier days, but something more grounded. Something that said, "I'm still scared, but I'm choosing this anyway." That, more than anything, meant everything. We didn't talk about what came next that night. She didn't unpack a bag or mark a new beginning with a kiss or a promise. Instead, she sat beside me on the porch steps, and we listened to the wind. For nearly an hour, we said nothing at all. And in that silence, we found our footing again. She leaned her shoulder into mine, and I let my hand rest lightly over hers. It wasn't a declaration of love or a vow, was more important than that. It was trust, gently given again. The next morning, I made coffee the way she liked, strong, with 2 teaspoons of honey and just a splash of milk. She stood in the doorway of my kitchen like she didn't quite know what to do with herself. Arms crossed loosely, hair still tousled from sleep. I handed her the mug and she took it, her fingers brushing mine. We both chuckled at how awkward it felt, like we were learning to dance again after forgetting the steps. And in a way, we were. The space we'd created before familiar, lived in, full of laughter and late-night conversations, had been disrupted. And now we were walking carefully through it, checking for cracks and hoping the foundation still held. It did, but not without shifts. We both sensed it. Rebuilding closeness after space isn't a clean return, it's a relearning, a refining. We had to name things now that we used to leave unsaid, or before she might pull away during a hard conversation, now she tried haltingly, messily, but sincerely, to stay present. Where I once would bury my own discomforts beneath action and distraction, I began saying things out loud, even when they weren't fully formed. There were stumbles. Like the morning she caught me checking my phone a little too often and asked, "Were you expecting someone else?" The words stung, not because they weren't fair, but because they exposed a soft wound we hadn't covered. Yet, I set the phone down, looked her in the eyes and said, "No, just habit. You're here now." And she nodded. Breathing in like that was something she needed to believe each time she heard it. We made space for questions. 2 small but important ones. Did she feel overwhelmed when I brought up long-term plans? Sometimes. Did I worry that she'd drift again if life got too hard? A little, were we both willing to keep showing up, even when it wasn't convenient? Yes, those kinds of conversations didn't wrap up in single sittings. Sometimes they spilled over into days, revisited over breakfast, unraveled during long walks, smoothed over while lying side by side in the quiet of night. The important thing was, we were having them. No longer avoiding, no longer pretending. We didn't feel the tremors underneath the surface. There was a Sunday afternoon when we found ourselves in her backyard, cleaning up the old garden beds she had left unattended for too long. The sky hung heavy with the scent of early summer, warm soil and grass mingling in the air, and we both wore old clothes we didn't mind ruining. It should have been simple, just yard work, just shared effort, but somehow it became a kind of metaphor for us. She stood over the cracked ceramic pot by the fence and said, "I never replaced this because I wasn't sure if it was worth fixing." I looked up from where I was digging and said, "Maybe not replacing it is its own kind of choice." She didn't answer right away, just stared at the pot a little longer, then gently set it aside and began clearing weeds. We worked quietly. After that, not because there was nothing to say, but because sometimes being side by side says more than words ever could. We were also learning how to hold each other through fear. One night she woke from a dream, breathless and shaken, and for the first time she didn't retreat into herself. Instead, she whispered, "I had a dream you left." I turned to face her in the dark, pulled her closer and said, "I'm still here. I'm still choosing you." And in the quiet that followed, I felt her exhale all the worries she hadn't told me about in the daylight. We both had ghosts, old hurts, doubts, patterns learned from parents and exes and years of survival. But we were learning to let them sit beside us without letting them drive the story. Around that time, we started going out more. Not just hidden dinners at home or lazy mornings wrapped in blankets. We walked through the town market hand in hand. We browsed antique stores, shared pastries at the little corner bakery where the cashier started recognizing us. People noticed. Some looked with surprise, others with curiosity, but slowly we stopped caring. What mattered more was how we looked. At each other, how present we were in those small moments, how natural it felt to laugh together in public again. No longer guarded, no longer wondering if we were something to hide. One particularly warm evening, she invited me to a small dinner her friend was hosting, a gathering of artists and teachers and friends she'd known for years. It was the first time she brought me into that side of her world. I was nervous, but I didn't show it. She introduced me simply, without a label, just, "This is Theo." No fanfare, no explanation, but the way she said it told the room everything they needed to know. Her friends were kind, curious, accepting. One even pulled me aside and said, "She hasn't looked this at ease in a long time." That meant more than I could say. It felt like a quiet confirmation. A blessing passed between people who'd seen her through seasons I hadn't yet known. After the dinner, as we walked back to her car, she reached for my hand without hesitation. And as the breeze moved around us, carrying the scent of jasmine and warm asphalt, she turned to me and said, "I think I'm ready now." Not for some big declaration, but ready to stop running. From you, from this, I didn't say anything right away. I just smiled and squeezed her hand, because the truth was, I had already known. Not from her words, but from how she had started to linger a little longer at my door. From how she started folding her life into mine again. One morning mug and garden bed at a time, the quiet between us had evolved into something rich and unspoken, shared breath rather than an absence of words. By now, we had learned to move through each other's worlds without knocking over the fragile things. I no longer flinched when she retreated to silence, and she no longer feared my steady presence as something too heavy to carry. We were growing into something neither of us could have predicted when I first knelt beside her car in that driveway months ago. But growth doesn't come without friction. And love, as tender and healing as it can be, sometimes casts light into corners we hadn't meant to expose. It started with a memory, or rather a fragment of one. We were at a small bookstore downtown, one of those cozy, maze-like places that smell like paper and stories and time. She wandered off into the poetry. While I browsed through old car manuals, someone had turned into a quirky display near the register. When I looked up, she was frozen, a thin paperback open in her hands. Her lips parted slightly, her expression unreadable. I stepped closer, slowly, careful not to startle her, and asked if she was okay. She nodded but didn't speak. After a beat, she placed the book back on the shelf, turned to me with a half-forced smile, and said she was ready to go. We didn't speak much the rest of the evening, but something lingered between us, some ghost that had been awakened. The next day, she came over with a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine, like nothing had shifted. But I could feel it in the way she moved around my kitchen. She was gentler, softer in places, but also distant, as if part of her had stepped back to observe from a distance. We sat on the porch after dinner, the wine open between us, and I asked her what had happened in the bookstore. Ate for a long moment, then said, "That book. It reminded me of him, of my ex-husband." The words hung in the air like dust, visible in the fading sunlight. I didn't flinch. I just waited. She began to tell me, in slow, deliberate sentences, about a part of her life I hadn't fully been introduced to. Knew she'd been married once, years ago, but she'd only ever referred to it in passing, like a closed chapter she didn't need to reopen. But now the door creaked. She told me how he had been her first big love, the kind that sweeps in like a storm and convinces you it's all or nothing. They had met young, married younger, and for a while it was magic, till it wasn't. She spoke about the slow unraveling, the emotional withdrawal, the long stretches of silence that turned into resentment. She told me how he used to buy her poetry books when they were still pretending things could be fixed. That particular one, the one she'd held in the store, had been the last book he gave her, before they finally stopped pretending. Listening to her speak so openly, so vulnerably, I didn't feel jealous. I felt honored. This wasn't a comparison. And when she paused, waiting to see how I'd react, I reached for her hand and said, "Thank you for telling me." She looked relieved but still guarded, like she wasn't. Sure, if I'd just given her a pass or a promise, I clarified, "Your past doesn't scare me. If anything, it tells me how hard you've fought to still believe in connection." She didn't respond immediately, just leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there for a long while, stars slowly appearing overhead, but healing is rarely linear. And the conversation that started on that porch opened something wider. In the days that followed, I noticed her slipping into old rhythms, staying later at work, dodging plans we'd made with little excuses, answering my calls with that subtle delay in her voice that told me she was already somewhere else emotionally. I didn't push. I knew that old wounds don't disappear just because we acknowledge them. Sometimes they flare up in the face of new hope. Sometimes. They ask to be felt all over again, just to be sure they've been seen. Then came the evening that tested us. We had planned to drive out to the lake, something we had talked about since spring. It was one of those places she used to visit as a kid, where the water was still and the light bent perfectly across its surface at sunset. We'd packed snacks, blankets, and even brought along one of those disposable film cameras for fun. But she never showed up. I waited outside her apartment for nearly an hour. I called twice, texted once, no response. At first, I told myself something had come up. Traffic, a dead phone, anything. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't an accident. This was a retreat. I drove home with a tightness in my chest I hadn't felt in months. Not anger, not even sadness, just fear. The fear that this beautiful, fragile thing we had built might be slipping again through fingers too tired to hold. I didn't call her that night. I didn't text again. I just waited. And in that waiting, I had to confront my own fears, my own patterns. I thought back to every time I'd told myself I could fix what was broken if I just worked hard enough. Every time I'd carried someone's weight until I broke under it. And I asked myself, what does love mean if I'm the only one holding the door open? The next day she came to my shop. No call, no warning, just walked in like the silence hadn't stretched so far, it was about to snap. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but she walked straight to me and said, "I'm sorry I didn't speak." I just looked at her, waiting. She continued. I panicked. When I started feeling happy again, really happy, I got scared. Hey, maybe I was betraying the part of me that learned to survive without hope. Her voice broke a little on that last word. I didn't know how to tell you, so I didn't. I exhaled, the tension easing just slightly. I can't chase you, Eloise, I said gently. Not because I don't want to, but because I need to know you want to be caught. She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks now. I just don't always know how. I stepped closer then, not to fix her, but to meet her halfway. Then we'll learn together, I said. No expectations, no timelines. Just the truth, even when it's messy. That evening, we didn't talk much. She stayed at my place again, and we moved around each other in a quiet kind of tenderness, like two people rebuilding, not from scratch, but from intention. When she fell asleep on the couch, curled up in one of my old sweatshirts, I sat beside her and watched the way her breathing steadied. I realized then that love wasn't about fixing what's broken. It's about sitting with what's imperfect and still choosing to stay. There was no sudden transformation. No dramatic pivot that made everything magically better. What came next was quieter, more ordinary, and in some ways, more profound. Beauty of second chances isn't in their spectacle, it's in the slow, deliberate choosing that happens each day. And that's exactly what followed. We began again, not with grand declarations or sweeping promises, but with the small and consistent gestures that had first built the bridge between us. She started leaving her scarf on the back of my chair again, half forgetting it, or maybe doing it on purpose. I began keeping an extra toothbrush by the sink, not because she asked, but because it felt right. Mornings came with shared silence and coffee brewed just the way she liked, and sometimes we'd sit on the porch and talk. About nothing at all, content just to be in the same place. The healing was in the rhythm. It was in how she started texting me again, just to say she was thinking of me, or to share something funny she'd seen at work. It was in how I began involving her in the mundane parts of my life, the errands, the grocery lists, the oil changes, and tire rotations. Not as a test, but as an invitation. We weren't trying to impress each other anymore. We were simply being. And in that simplicity, something solid began to form. She surprised me one afternoon by cooking a full meal at my place, something she rarely did, usually leaving the kitchen to me. I came home to the smell of garlic and lemon, soft music playing from the corner speaker, and her hair tied up in that loose knot she wore when she was comfortable. She looked over her shoulder with a grin that reached her eyes, and for the first time in a while, I saw no trace of fear. That night we ate on the floor of my living room using old couch cushions. As seats, sipping wine and laughing over spilled sauce and burnt edges. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Sometimes, I'd catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Not with suspicion or worry, but with something else. Curiosity. Like she was still learning who I was, still discovering. New pieces of me, even after all this time, I welcomed it. I wanted to be known fully, flaws and all. And I wanted to know her, not just the version of her that smiled and said all the right things, but the version that got quiet when she was unsure, the one that pulled her sleeves over her hands when she needed comfort. I noticed those things, and I made sure she knew I saw them without judgment. Her vulnerability became a language we both learned to speak. One night, after a long day, she sat beside me on the couch and said, "I used to think I was too much, too complicated, too guarded. But with you, I don't feel like I have to shrink." I didn't respond right away. I just wrapped my arm around her and held her close, letting her words settle into the space between us like sunlight through a dusty window. She didn't need fixing. She needed space to bloom. We took small trips together, nowhere far, just a couple hours out of town. One weekend we drove to the coast, rented a tiny cabin with creaky floorboards and windows that rattled in the wind. We walked the shoreline barefoot, collecting smooth stones and pieces of driftwood. She wrote our initials in the sand with a stick and laughed when the tide rushed in too quickly to wash it away. I took a picture, not of the initials, but of her expression, genuine, carefree, a kind of joy I wanted to remember. That night, we lay awake listening to the ocean outside the window, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. In that quiet, I realized I no longer feared the silence. It had become our companion, not our enemy, a place where we could both rest. There was progress, yes, but also setbacks. Moments when she'd pull away mid-conversation or go silent for reasons even she couldn't articulate. At times when I'd misinterpret a glance or a phrase and start retreating into my own defenses. But the difference now was how we handled those moments. We named them. We stayed in the room. We talked through the discomfort instead of walking away from it. One evening, after a tense misunderstanding, she looked at me and said, "I want to unlearn the part of me that runs, but I need you to be patient." I nodded, knowing full well what it meant to unlearn survival patterns. "I've got time," I said, and I meant it. It was around then that she started inviting me more fully into her world, not just the safe parts, but the complicated ones. She took me to meet her sister, someone she had always described as a little protective. It went better than either of us expected. Her sister watched me closely during dinner, asked questions that felt slightly loaded, but in the end, she gave a nod of approval that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I saw the way Eloise relaxed after that, like a weight she hadn't named, had finally lifted. Later that night, she confessed, "I think part of me was waiting for someone else to see what I saw in you, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it." I told her she wasn't, that I saw her just as clearly. There were late nights spent listening to music, playlists she'd made years ago and hadn't shared with anyone until now. Songs that reminded her of lost summers and early heartbreaks, and long drives alone. I created a playlist for her, 2 songs that spoke to where we were, who we were becoming. We played them in the background of our lives, letting lyrics speak when we didn't know how. Music became another language, another bridge. Slowly, steadily, we were building a life not just around each other, but with each other. Not in a codependent way, but in a way that allowed for breath, for room to grow. We didn't talk about forever, not in those exact words, but it began to settle into the background of our days, unspoken, but understood. The toothbrush by the sink, the extra pillow on the bed, the way we both automatically grabbed 2 cups in the morning instead of 1. These were not just habits, they were quiet declarations. But I knew that the real test of what we had wouldn't come in the softness. It would come when things got hard again, when life pushed back. And I also knew that we weren't the same people we had been at the start. We were still learning, still evolving, but we had chosen each other over and over. And every day, we were still choosing. That, I realized, is what love really is. Not the absence of fear or conflict, but the continued return to each other in spite of them. The complication came, as it always does, not with warning or fanfare, but with a phone call in the middle of a perfectly ordinary day. I was beneath the hood of an old pickup at the shop when my phone buzzed against the metal toolbox. I wiped my hands on a rag and picked up, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But the voice on the other end was shaky, unfamiliar, and yet laced with urgency. It was Eloise's mother's caregiver, calling from a number I didn't recognize. Her voice was calm but urgent as she explained that her mother had taken a bad fall and had been rushed to the hospital. They needed someone to make decisions, until Eloise arrived. I barely had time to gather the details before I was out the door, calling Eloise on the way. She answered on the second ring, and the moment I told her, I heard the breath leave her body like she'd been punched in the stomach. By the time I reached the hospital, she was already there, pacing the lobby in a daze. My eyes were red, not from crying, but from the sheer shock of it. Her mother had been living independently with part-time assistants, stubborn and proud as ever. But now, things had changed. A fractured hip, minor concussion, and a slow recovering memory lapse meant she wasn't going home anytime soon. The next few days passed in a blur of white walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and paperwork none of us were prepared for. I stayed by Eloise's side as much as I could, bringing her coffee, walking her down to the cafeteria. Driving her home late when she refused to leave until visiting hours were over. It was during those long waits and silent elevator rides that I saw a version of her I hadn't met before: the daughter, caretaker. The woman stretched so thin she could barely hold herself together, yet she did. Because that's who she was: quietly strong, relentlessly loving, and terrified that one more blow might break her. At night, when she did come home with me, she barely spoke. She'd shower, change into one of my oversized shirts, and curl up on the couch, phone clutched in her hand just in case the hospital called. I didn't push her. I simply sat beside her, sometimes reading aloud from whatever book was on the coffee table. Other times just holding her hand while we watched the flicker of the television neither of us were really paying attention to. There's something sacred about being allowed to witness someone's pain, to be the one they collapse beside when the world is too much. I didn't try to fix it, I knew better. I was there to absorb what I could, quietly, without asking for more than she had to give. But pressure reveals things. As the days stretched into weeks, the strain began to show. One evening she snapped, not cruelly, but sharply, when I asked if she'd eaten. "I don't need a babysitter," she said, the exhaustion seeping through every syllable. I didn't take it personally. I just nodded, stepped back, and let her have the space she clearly needed. But later that night, she came into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, her face drawn and guilty. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I'm not handling this well." I sat up, leaned forward, and took her hand. "You don't have to handle it well," I said. "You just have to let me walk through it with you." Her mother's recovery was slow, and the doctors recommended a move to a rehabilitation facility, and likely assisted living after that. Eloise struggled with the decision. The guilt tore at her, the sense that she was failing her mother by not taking her home. But she also knew she wasn't equipped, emotionally or physically, to be a full-time caregiver. One night, she broke down completely, sobbing in my arms like all the strength she'd been holding had finally splintered. "What kind of daughter am I if I let her go somewhere else?" she asked, voice raw. I held her tighter, knowing this wasn't a question. With a clean answer: "You're the kind of daughter who loves her enough to make the right choice, even when it hurts," I told her. Eventually, with heavy heart and trembling resolve, she agreed to the transition. During this time, everything else in our lives fell to the background. We stopped going on weekend drives. The music stayed off. Even our little rituals, coffee together, quiet porch mornings, became sporadic. We were surviving, and sometimes that had to be enough. But what I found in those hard weeks was this: our love didn't disappear in the face of stress. It transformed. It became less about romance and more about presence. It's less about gestures and more about endurance. I learned the schedules of her mother's rehab center. Elle brought dinner when she forgot to eat, cleaned her apartment when she didn't have the energy to do it herself. She didn't ask. I just did it, because love often speaks loudest through what goes unspoken. Eventually, there came a Saturday morning when she woke up beside me and said, "I feel like I can breathe again." She looked at me with eyes not entirely free of pain, but full of something steadier: gratitude, trust, maybe even hope. We spent that day doing nothing of consequence. We stayed in bed longer than we should have, made pancakes at noon, went for a drive with no destination in mind. It wasn't a celebration. It was a sigh of relief, a return to ourselves. That night, as we lay on the hood of my truck staring at the stars, she said, "I don't know what I would have done without you." I told her the truth. "You would have survived, because that's who you are. But I'm glad you didn't have to do it alone." Her mother's condition stabilized over the next month, and with that came a sense of rhythm again. We weren't exactly picking up where we left off. Too much had changed, but we were beginning something new, a deeper understanding, a thicker thread between us. We had weathered something real, something that could have easily broken us. But instead, it revealed the strength of what we'd built. Not flashy, not flawless, but deeply rooted. One evening, we sat on her balcony with takeout containers in our laps and music playing softly behind us. She turned to me suddenly and said, "Do you ever think about the beginning? That day with my car?" I smiled. "All the time." She laughed softly, then said, "If someone told me back then that you'd be the person I'd lean on the most in the worst time of my life, I wouldn't have believed it." I shrugged. That's the thing about beginnings. You never know what's about to grow. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the city lights, I realized we were no longer navigating the uncertainty of a new connection. We were something else now, something forged, tested, and still standing. The quiet after the storm often feels disorienting, like you've braced so long for impact that the stillness makes you suspicious. That's how it felt in the weeks following. Eloise's mother's transition to assisted living. We returned to a rhythm, yes, but there was a kind of emotional jet lag we both carried, a slowness in how we settled back into ourselves. It was peaceful, but tinged with that uneasy awareness that life, in its unpredictable way, could throw another curve at any moment. We didn't say it out loud, but I could sense it in the way we clung to normalcy. She started cooking again, simple meals with mismatched spices and too much garlic. I took on more clients at the shop, making up for the days I'd missed while sitting with her in hospital waiting rooms. On the surface, we looked like a couple who had found their way back. Underneath, we were quietly watching the horizon. Then came the shift we hadn't anticipated, not a loss, but an opportunity that could change everything. It started with an email. Eloise had applied months ago for a consulting position with a nonprofit focused on women's healthcare advocacy, a long shot. She had said at the time, half laughing as she submitted the application late one night while sipping wine in my living room, she never expected to hear back. But now, they wanted to fly her out to Portland for a final interview. The role would be full-time, high responsibility, and located across the country. A move. A major one. When she first told me, I saw the excitement flash across her face, the kind she rarely let herself feel. But then it was quickly tempered by caution, a kind of bracing for disappointment. I told her she had to go. No hesitation, no guilt. "You deserve this," I said. She nodded slowly, the weight of reality already beginning to settle on her shoulders. She flew out the following week. And those 3 days without her felt longer than they should have. I kept busy fixing up an old Bronco in the garage and cleaning every surface of the apartment like I was preparing for an inspection. I didn't want to think too hard about what her absence meant, but I couldn't help imagining both outcomes: one where she came back saying it wasn't the right fit, and one where she walked in glowing with the news that she'd been offered the job. I didn't know which would scare me more. When she returned, she didn't speak right away. We drove back from the airport in near silence, her fingers drumming anxiously on her thigh. Didn't push. I waited. Back at the apartment, she finally said they offered it. "I start in 6 weeks if I accept." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the battle happening behind her eyes. Joy fighting fear. Hope tangled with doubt. "Do you want it?" I asked. She nodded. "I do. But I don't know what that means for us." It was the conversation we both knew had to come, but neither of us wanted to initiate. Over the next few days, we danced around it, each waiting for the other to make the first move. But eventually, we sat on the floor of her apartment, a bottle of wine between us, and a silence too heavy to ignore. "This doesn't have to be an ending," I said carefully, "but it is a fork in the road." She looked at me, tears already forming in her eyes. "I don't want to lose what we've built." I reached for her hand. "Then we don't have to. But we need to be honest about what's next." We discussed every possibility: long distance, visiting each other monthly, her taking the job and seeing how it goes for the first 6 months before making a permanent move. I even considered the idea of following her eventually, though I didn't say it right away. My life, my work, my roots were here. But so was she. And I'd be lying if I said that didn't change things. Ultimately, we agreed she would accept the job, would try long distance at first. It wasn't ideal, but it was real. It was what we could do with what we had. We made promises, calls every evening, trips planned ahead of time, honesty above all else. We knew it would be hard. But we also knew we had already survived hard. Her last few weeks before the move were a mix of tenderness and anxiety. We tried to make the most of every moment without letting the countdown steal our peace. There were quiet dinners, long walks, spontaneous nights spent watching old movies and dancing in the living room with socks on the hardwood floor. But there were also moments of tension, fear creeping in, asking questions neither of us could answer. Would the distance make us drift apart? Would she thrive in a new city and forget how it felt to sit on this couch wrapped in this life? On the night before her flight, we stood on the porch watching the city lights blur in the distance. She leaned into me, her head against my chest, and whispered, "Promise me we won't let this be the end." I kissed the top of her head and whispered back, "I'm not saying goodbye. Just see you soon." It wasn't poetic. It wasn't grand, but it was true. The morning she left, I drove her to the airport. We didn't say much, just held hands in the car, the kind of silence that said everything we needed. At the terminal, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, then pulled back with tears in her eyes and said, "Don't forget me." I smiled, even as my chest ached. Impossible. Driving back alone was harder than I'd expected. Apartment felt too quiet, the bed too large. But I reminded myself of all we had built, not just a romance, but a partnership, a foundation. And I knew that if this love could survive grief, misunderstanding, and distance, it could survive this too. In the weeks that followed, we kept our promises. Calls every night, even if short. Voice notes, photos from her new neighborhood. Shh. Tell me about the cafe on the corner that served amazing croissants, about the coworker who reminded her of her sister, about the apartment she was slowly turning into a home. And I told her about the shop, about the cars I fixed, and the little things that reminded me of her. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy. It was still us. And in that, there was hope. Long-distance relationships are the ultimate test of patience and intention. They revealed the scaffolding beneath all the romances, the trust, the communication, the willingness to show up even when you can't touch, can't hold, can't read the face across the dinner table. When Eloise left for Portland, I told myself, it wouldn't change anything. I thought our foundation was strong enough, and in many ways it was. But what I hadn't anticipated was how empty the small things would feel without her in them. The quiet coffee before work, the way she curled her feet beneath her on the couch, the scent of her shampoo lingering on my pillow. These weren't grand gestures, but they had become part of the rhythm of my life. And without them, everything felt just slightly offbeat, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. In the first week, we spoke every day, sometimes twice. We'd video chat at night, her face illuminated by soft apartment lighting while she recounted her day-new coworkers. The strange guy at the bakery, a client meeting that went unexpectedly well. I'd tell her about a difficult repair at the shop, about the old man who came in just to talk because his wife had passed last year and he didn't like the silence. Tried to laugh, tried to keep things light, but beneath it all was that ache, that unspoken knowledge that time and distance were slowly stretching the string between us. Neither of us said it aloud, but I knew we both felt it. Still, we pressed forward. We marked calendars with visit dates. She booked a flight home for 6 weeks out. I planned to see her city in the fall, told her I'd help fix up her apartment, maybe install a couple ceiling fans, or shelf any excuse to be useful. But as the weeks went on, life began to get louder. Her new job came with long hours, travel, unexpected responsibilities. My workload at the shop picked up too. Summertime always did that. Missed a call one night, then another. Conversations shortened. Text messages became more functional than emotional. The first argument came at the 4-week mark. Something small, me forgetting to remind her about a doctor's appointment she mentioned. Her missing our video chat because of an after-hours meeting. But it wasn't really about that. It was about the distance. It's about the fear that maybe we were becoming strangers again, slipping into separate lives that couldn't touch. We apologized, of course. We always did. But the cracks had formed, and once they appear, they tend to echo louder than they are. The next few weeks were filled with more silences. Not the comfortable kind we'd once shared, but tense pauses where the right words just didn't come. I didn't want to pressure her. I knew how much this opportunity meant, how hard she'd worked for it. But I also didn't want to be forgotten. In the wake of it, one night I almost asked her if she still saw a future for us. I typed it out in a message, hovered over the send button, then deleted it. Instead, I called her and told her I was proud of her. She cried when I said it. She said no one else had told her that in weeks. That's the thing about love. It's not just about proximity. It's about choosing each other over and over, even when it would be easier not to. And we did choose each other again and again. But some days it felt more like endurance than joy. One afternoon, I drove past the spot where we'd first met, outside that broken-down car with the busted alternator. The memory felt like a lifetime ago. I parked for a moment, just sat there, thinking about how far we'd come and how much further we had to go. I sent her a photo of the spot. She replied minutes later with a heart emoji and a voice message that said, "That day changed everything." For me, by the time her 6-week visit rolled around, I didn't know what to expect. I was excited, sure, but nervous too. Had we grown apart too much? Would the spark still be there? The comfort we'd once found in each other come back naturally? Or would we have to force it? When I saw her step through the arrivals gate, those questions evaporated. She looked tired, a little older in the way stress subtly reshapes a person, but still her, still Eloise. She dropped her bags and hugged me like it hurt not to. That week together felt like a soft reset. We didn't do anything extravagant. Stayed in, cooked simple meals, walked the same familiar trails, visited her mother, who lit up at the sight of her daughter. The conversations returned not just about daily life, but the deeper ones we'd avoided. She admitted how lonely she felt some nights. I told her how much I'd missed her laugh, the way she always knew when I was holding something back. We cried. We held each other, made love with the urgency of people trying to memorize skin, and afterward, we lay still, not talking, letting our breathing sink. One evening, as we sat out on the porch wrapped in a blanket, she said something that stuck with me. I thought getting everything I wanted would make things easier, but all it did was remind me that what I want most still isn't finished. I looked at her, brow furrowed, unsure. "What do you mean?" She smiled, touched my hand. "I mean us. We're still in the middle of it, still figuring it out. And I don't want to get so caught up in building a life I forget who I'm building it with." That hit me like a freight train, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. We weren't perfect, we weren't seamless, but we were trying. And that counted for more than anything else. She flew back to Portland a few days later, but this time felt different. We had a plan. I would come visit her in 3 weeks. She'd try to fly back again a month after that. We committed to doing more than surviving the distance. We committed to shaping our lives so the distance wouldn't be permanent. She started looking into hybrid roles, seeing if there was any path back to our city without sacrificing her work. God began researching jobs in her area quietly, just to see what the world might offer. Neither of us made promises we couldn't keep, but we both made one that mattered most. We would not let each other go without a fight. Love isn't always about proximity. Sometimes it's about patience, about presence in absence, about whispering. Across time zones, I'm still here, meaning it with everything you have. The end of summer arrived in quiet, golden tones. Days stretched a little longer, and the air began to carry that crisp edge hinting that change was coming. Had been nearly 4 months since Eloise moved to Portland. We had both done everything we could to keep the thread between us taut and unbroken. I visited twice, each time letting myself fall in love with the new parts of her world, her small but cozy apartment decorated with postcards and potted plants. The smell of roasted coffee that lingered on her block, the way she came alive in. Her work meetings' eyes alight with purpose and passion. But despite the beauty of her new life, there was always something unfinished in her expression when she'd look at me across her kitchen table. Like even surrounded by everything I thought she wanted something someone was still missing. We were both holding on, but we had also reached a point where holding on wasn't enough. We needed to decide. Couldn't keep floating between 2 places, 2 lives, hoping it would magically solve itself. Our visits became harder to leave. From, our partings heavier. The last time I dropped her at the airport, we lingered by the curb until the security guard asked us to move. She didn't cry, but her fingers trembled when they slid from mine. That night, alone in my bed, I stared at the ceiling until morning light crept through the blinds and made the dust particles dance like memories suspended in air. Something had to give. And surprisingly, it came not through a grand conversation or confrontation, but through a simple opportunity neither of us had seen coming. It started with a casual conversation at the shop. A longtime client of mine, a quiet man named Dennis, who owned a chain of eco-friendly auto garages out west, was in town visiting family. He stopped by the shop to check on the old Jeep I'd been restoring for him. We talked, caught up, and somewhere between hood inspections and tire checks. He mentioned that he'd be expanding into Oregon specifically, Portland. He needed someone reliable to head the new shop. Someone who knew how to manage people, build trust with the community, and, most importantly, understood the rhythm of work that wasn't about speed but care. He asked me if I knew anyone. I paused for a long moment, then said, "Maybe I do." That night, I called Eloise and told her. At first, she didn't say anything. Just silence on the other end of the line, and a whispered, "Are you serious?" I told her I hadn't decided anything yet. I needed time to think, that I needed to know it was more than a gesture or a moment of romantic impulse. But deep down, I knew the moment Dennis made the offer, I had already made up my mind. It wasn't about sacrifice. It was about alignment. Life was handing us a chance to stop living between airport gates and late-night calls, and finally live something real together. The next few days were a haze of logistics. I talked to Dennis again, reviewed the offer, asked for time to visit the Portland location before committing. Eloise, for her part, didn't pressure me. She let me move at my pace, but I could feel her hoping softly, silently, in the way she'd ask, "How was the shop talk today?" Or mention a small place near her apartment that served the best chicken pot pie I'd ever tasted. She was waiting without asking. I respected that. But I also knew I owed her clarity, so I flew out again, this time under the pretense of a regular visit. We spent the first day doing what we always did. Quiet morning coffee. Walking through the farmer's market, holding hands like time hadn't stretched us. Then I asked her to come with me to the potential shop location. It was nothing special, yet just a dusty garage with a flickering sign and walls that needed more paint than I cared to admit. But as I showed her around, pointing out where I'd install the lifts, where the front desk would go, I caught the glimmer in her eye. Not just pride, but relief, hope, possibility. That night, I sat on her rooftop with paper plates of takeout and a blanket wrapped around our shoulders. I turned to her and said, "I want to do this. I'm going to take the job." She blinked fast, like she wasn't sure she heard me right. "You are?" I nodded, heart pounding but sure. "I want to stop visiting you. I want to come home to you." The tears came then, not dramatic, but soft and steady. She leaned into me and whispered, "I've been trying not to dream of this, because I didn't want to break my own heart." I held her tighter and told her she didn't have to hold back anymore. Over the next month, we began the process of untangling and reweaving our lives. I gave my notice at the shop. Dennis helped arrange my relocation, and we started preparing the new location in earnest. It was strange to leave behind the city I'd called home for most of my life. The streets I could navigate blindfolded, the clients who'd become more like old friends. But I wasn't running. I was moving forward, toward something. Toward someone. Eloise and I found a small house not far from her apartment. It had a porch with peeling paint and a yard overrun with weeds, but it also had charm real, lived-in charm. We'd fix it up together. That was the plan. Build something brick by brick, both literally and figuratively. Her mother, now more stable and happy in her assisted living community, was thrilled by the news. Said she'd always known I'd find my way to her daughter for good. Maybe mothers do know these things before we do. The day I arrived in Portland for the final time, not as a visitor, but as a man who had chosen his future, I walked through the front door of our new place and saw her standing there barefoot, paintbrush in one hand, hair tied in a messy knot. She turned, smiled, and said, "Welcome home." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. There's something unspoken and tender about the quiet days after the big decisions are made. When the dust settles and real life begins, not the cinematic moments of reunion or the excitement of change, but the subtle, steady rhythm of being. That's what life with Eloise became in the months after I moved to Portland. It wasn't a parade or a daily fireworks show. It was morning coffee brewed a little too strong, paint-stained fingers from weekends spent fixing up the house, and soft laughter echoing down the hallway as we figured out how to share not just space, but time, energy, and future plans. It was brushing our teeth together in a small bathroom that always steamed up too fast and bumping into each other in the kitchen while figuring out dinner. And it was good. It was real. The garage opened quietly. No grand launch or ribbon cutting. Just a dusty sign that said Reynolds & Co., and a slowly growing line of neighbors who were curious to see who had moved in. I worked with my hands every day, the way I always had. But now the days felt fuller, not because the work was different, but because it had meaning tied to something beyond bolts and timing belts. At night I'd come home to the smell of roasted vegetables or Thai takeout, depending on how her day had gone. She'd be sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a look that said she'd been waiting for me. Sometimes we talked about everything. Other nights we said almost nothing. It didn't matter. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. We took our time building our life. No rushing into marriage or checking off milestones just because other people did. We painted rooms slowly, one wall at a time, arguing over colors and laughing about how bad we were at taping the edges. We adopted a senior dog from the shelter, a half-blind mutt named Grover, who snored louder than any human I'd ever met. On weekends, we'd walk through the park with Grover lumbering ahead, her hand in mine. And I'd think about how far we'd come from that first afternoon in front of her. Stalled-out car. I sometimes caught her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, this soft, grateful gaze like she was, still surprised I was there. And I'd look back at her the same way, 'cause honestly I was just as surprised, not because I ever doubted her worth, but because I never imagined that something as simple as fixing a car could lead me to the deepest kind of companionship I'd ever known. She still joked about our age gap, sometimes teasing me when my back ached after lifting something heavy, or when I didn't know the pop culture reference she threw out from her teenage years. But those little jabs were always followed by her hand reaching for mine, or her head resting on my shoulder. She was 42 when we met. Now she was almost 44, and somehow, with every passing year, she seemed even more herself, wiser, softer in the right ways, stronger in the others. Eloise continued to flourish in her role at the nonprofit. I watched her confidence bloom, watched her take up space in rooms where she once might have second-guessed herself. I cheered her on from the sidelines, always ready with flowers after big presentations, always reminding her that she was allowed to want more and go after it. In return, she showed up for me in ways I'd never known were possible. She came to the shop with sandwiches when I worked late, helped me organize invoices even though she hated spreadsheets, and told every single person she met that her boyfriend was the best mechanic on the West Coast. We weren't perfect. There were still disagreements about money, about how to discipline Grover when he chewed on shoes, about whether to host her loud cousins for Thanksgiving. But the fights were different now. They weren't laced with fear of losing each other. They were just two people navigating life together, figuring it out as they went. There was no more questioning whether we'd make it. We just did. One evening in early spring, almost a year after I moved, we sat on our back porch watching the sky turn shades of lavender and blue. She leaned into me and said, almost like she was thinking aloud, I used to believe I had missed my window. That love like this only happened in your 20s, before baggage and timelines got in the way. I kissed the top of her head and replied, I think the window opens when you're finally ready to look through it. She laughed, soft and warm, and said, then I'm glad you showed up outside mine with a wrench. That night we danced. In the kitchen, with no music, just the sound of rain tapping the windows and Grover's soft snores in the background. We didn't talk about marriage or what came next. We didn't need to. We had arrived. We were here. That was enough. Every now and then, someone at the shop would ask about the framed photo on my desk, me and Eloise in front of her old Honda Civic. Grease on my shirt, her laughing at something I just said. I'd tell them it was the day everything changed. They'd ask if I fixed the car, and I'd smile and say, eventually, but she fixed me faster. I still think about that first moment when she said, "You're so young and handsome. I'm already 42. It was playful, flirty, maybe. Even a little sad at the edges, but looking back now, I see it for what it really was. A moment of vulnerability. A woman peeking out from behind the wall she'd built and daring to see if someone might meet her there. And I did. I met her. Not with promises or performances, but with a steady heart and open hands. So no, this wasn't the story of a whirlwind romance or a dramatic love affair. This was the story of two people who found each other when they thought they were done looking, who built a life not on fireworks, but on foundation, who learned that love, real love, is showing up not just once, but over and over again. And that, I think, is more romantic than anything else. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.